Hello, this is Mr. Fredericks. Today we have a screencast on the Spanish-American War, part of our imperialism unit. Imperialism, of course, being a policy of a society to extend its power by basically taking over either economically or militarily another society. So let's get at it. In 1898, um, why did the Spanish-American War occur? Because apparently it did happen in 1898. Well, kind of to find out, we're going to look at the history. So back in 1492, Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean. Well, either way, he came to the Western world, discovering the Western world, at least for the European powers, letting them know it was there, even though lots of people were already here. And he did so for Spain, although the common consensus is he was from Italy. So he discovered this area, and ultimately that's going to open up what we know as Latin America today. That would be North, Central, and South America to the European exploration. So he's gonna do a couple voyages, but one of the main ones, he's gonna land in Cuba. And again, Cuba is 94 miles away from the United States. And where in the world is Cuba again? If we look at this map, kind of confusing. Bam, right there. So we want to have a sense of where Cuba is, because when we talk about the Spanish-American War, Cuba is going to be literally at the center of it. So at this time, Spain is powerful, and they're going to go after Latin America and just basically conquer such a huge portion of it. Now, there's going to be some other powers that get in on it. You know, Portugal's going to play a major role, even France, but ultimately Spain is going to take most of Latin America, really just carve it up. So in the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s, Spain is going to dominate Latin America, South America, Central America. But once the 1800s come, this massive movement of nationalism is going to lead to revolution. And all of these places you see on the screen now, and I mean, that's a lot of places, all had revolutions. And they're going to kick the Spanish out. Spanish are not going to have a good couple decades. It's a lot of power they lost. So 99% of their colonies gone. That clearly makes Spain feel unloved, rejected, and the military losses could not have felt good either. However, they didn't lose anything. Well, they didn't lose everything. They didn't lose Puerto Rico. They didn't lose the island of Guam in the Pacific. They didn't lose the Philippines right against the southeast side of Asia. And they didn't lose Cuba, which would be very relevant to our conversation today. So out of all their land, they held on to four things. Now, I really want to emphasize that you feel protective of your children, but you certainly feel protective of your final four colonies when you've lost about 50 others. So it's going to be a little too bad for Spain, because those four colonies are going to be like, hey, I just watched everybody else gain their freedom. Why not me? So why did Cuba want their freedom? Well, a couple reasons. In 1803, Haiti, a high percentage of Haiti at the time were slaves. And the slaves are going to have a revolt against France. And when they do, they're going to gain their freedom, which is definitely a message to the rest of the world that freedom is possible if you have a revolution. So Haiti is going to become a legend, and the Cuban people are going to use that as a rally point. In 1776, even prior to Haiti, the United States had perhaps one of the greatest revolutions of all time, yelling freedom, freedom, and that's going to inspire countries all around the world. But once again, Cuba, and right next door, Cuba was there watching us enjoy freedom. That's going to lead to them being inspired. So the Cuban people are going to start to have revolutions as of the 1860s, and they're going to go through a few, and they're going to lose the first couple. However, they are going to keep trying. Now, one thing about these revolutions is the Spanish just were so much more traditionally powerful. So when the Cuban people that were a smaller group by population, less industrialized, went up against the Spanish military, they lost. So traditional warfare, fighting toe-to-toe, was not working for the Cuban people. So they turned to guerrilla warfare, kind of a hit-and-run warfare where you attack and run away, catch the enemy off guard, stay hidden in the woods, fire, and then run. So guerrilla warfare is a way to basically give your enemy a bunch of paper cuts, let's say a couple 100,000 of them, and become so annoying that the mother country, the conquering country, says we can't keep living this way, and they just eventually leave. It's not defeating your enemy outright. It's becoming so annoying and slowly bleeding them to death so they leave you alone. So guerrilla warfare is a tactic that will eventually be embraced by many revolutions. So the Spanish were feeling frustrated because when they got shot at or attacked, they often didn't know where, so they had no enemy to fight back against. Now, even if the Spanish did see the guerrilla fighters, all they had to do was run into a village and drop their weapons, and they would look like everybody else because guerrilla fighters did not wear uniforms. They did not fight on big fields, fight toe to toe. So something had to be done if the Spanish wanted to hold on to Cuba. So they brought in this expert, General Weyler, an expert on fighting the tactics of guerrilla warfare. And he said, I know what I can do about guerrilla warfare in Cuba. So if you don't know who the enemy is, you can't fight the enemy because they're hidden. If you look here, all hidden within civilians. So instead, you hide the civilians because those are the people you have access to. So that's his idea. Basically, take the civilians, lock them up, and once you lock them up, now you're exposing the guerrilla fighters. Anybody that you see out is the enemy. You can openly attack them. The enemy, the fighters, can't hide amongst the civilians. Now, this also does something else. The civilians generally are the ones that are providing food, besides the protection, the food and the weapons and everything that they need. So locking up the civilians, they'll no longer be able to provide the food and everything that the fighters need. So that is going to starve the guerrilla fighters out. However, these concentration camps, and that is the first use of the word in this revolution, we're going to concentrate the civilians by themselves, and then the guerrillas will be exposed. Now, these were called reconcentration camps. Later, this term would be applied towards the Holocaust, World War II, and Germany in general. So to be put into these camps, the civilians of Cuba had to leave their homes, which is traumatic. Let's not underestimate the power of taking somebody, making them give up their freedom, forcing them from losing their home, and then locking them up. So while the Cubans were in these camps, they weren't able to grow their foods, access their crops. These massively crowded places, this is a lesson we've learned recently, massive crowded places is going to lead to the spread of disease, particularly when your immune systems are compromised because you're facing malnutrition and lack of food. So 200,000 Cubans died ultimately from malnutrition, exposure to disease. So 200,000 people is a lot. Now, this is a real picture of the leader of the Cuban Revolution, looking at all of his dead people, people that ultimately died during this time. So who got sad and angry? The United States. It's very relative. All the stories that came out about all the Cuban people dying, all General Weyler's tactics of basically locking the civilian people of Cuba into concentration camps. So we started arguing with Spain because we love arguing. We're like, you need to get out of Cuba, get out of the Western Hemisphere. Spain was upset by this. Basically, Spain had been the most powerful country in the world for some time. Who's this United States telling them what to do? So they were not excited about us trying to boss them around. So the Spanish ambassador to the United States, so every country has to get along with every other country. So for diplomatic reasons and basically research, every country puts a person representing their government in every other country in the world. That's an ambassador. Well, De Lome was the Spanish ambassador living in the United States. So he ends up writing a letter during this time of awkwardness to the King of Spain. And he basically says, hey, we got to be a little careful here. The American people are a little irrational. President McKinley, he's not that smart. And ultimately, he's a bitter of the crowds. Basically meaning he's not going to do the right thing. He's just going to do what's popular, whatever the American people are complaining about. So it basically made McKinley look like a tool, a puppet, and unintelligent. And that letter is going to be captured and exposed to the public. And there's one thing the Americans don't like is when foreigners complain about their leader, their president. They were very protective of that. So this is called the De Lome letter, and it's going to be insulting, and it's going to rile up Americans. Now, McKinley gets insulted by this letter. Again, once again called weak and a bitter for the admiration of the crowds. But this makes the newspapers, it goes viral, it spreads, Americans get angry. And now, American newspapers at this point turn against Spain. Totally support the Cuban people, the revolutionaries. And they start publishing these political cartoons that look like this. Basically, that the Spanish troops were executing unarmed and tied up Cuban rebels. Doesn't seem fair. And this is going to make Spain look evil. Just endless political cartoons. and articles making Spain look awful. Now, the thing about this was totally biased. The Cuban rebels were absolutely killing the Spanish soldiers as well, committing atrocities as well. So it wasn't exactly like Spain was so evil and the Cuban rebels were so innocent. But certainly, if you were reading all the articles and looking at the political cartoons in America, that's what you thought. This made Spain angry. They saw this as propaganda of the worst kind, lies that were turning the world against them. And because of this anger, in Cuba, there's going to be some riots. Basically, the Spanish living in Cuba and the Cubans that supported Spain living in Cuba start finding Americans, because of course Americans live in every country, and attacking them. In this case, they actually burnt down 3 newspaper presses, American newspaper presses that were in Cuba. And those Americans fled for their lives. Now, this looked as if Americans' lives were in danger in Cuba. And again, there were a lot of Americans living peacefully in Cuba. So President McKinley said, I need to support Americans there. So he says, I will protect them. And he sends the USS Maine, a military ship with military sailors, into Havana, Cuba, to protect them. So one, it does provide literal protection for American citizens to go to the ship to seek protection. It also provides a military force to come out and stop rioting and help out any Americans that are in danger. But most importantly, it's kind of like a big message saying to Spain, behave yourself, don't attack Americans, we're right next to you, and we are here in force. Now, Spain's kind of like, this is my harbor. I own Cuba, you need to get out. Well, Spain and the United States definitely close to war. We were absolutely close with our military forces and aggravated. Now, I am an optimist by nature. Maybe they will settle their problems peacefully. Maybe they can hug it out, talk it out. Sure, these 2 intelligent powers can make it work. But then, February 15th, 1898, boom. Suddenly, anybody that was hanging around that harbor heard a huge explosion. The USS Maine just blew up. Absolutely blew up. And self-destruction. Well, not self-destruction, but destruction. Now, these are the coffins of the 266 U.S. sailors that died. They were brought back to Arlington Cemetery, where they are buried there to this day. There's a special component of Arlington Cemetery right outside of Washington, D.C. and Virginia for just these men that were killed. Now, this is going to anger and scare the United States. How dare our military men die? Now, immediately, the American press believed a Spanish mine had blown up this ship, that it was Spain that did this. So, but there are 4 reasons why further research makes this seem unlikely and even impossible. Reason number 1, a mine is exploded within the water. Now, did witnesses around the harbor see water shoot up? They did not. They just saw the boat blow up. So it's unlikely to be a mine. Reason number 2, there's 2 ways mines work. Number 1, when a ship hits a mine, breaking its outside case. Now that could not have happened because the USS Maine was anchored. It was not going to be moving at all. So the second way that a mine could work is if somebody attaches wires to it and sends an electronic charge into it to cause it manually to explode. And the problem with this is that's a long wire that would have to happen for somebody to manually set these off. And no wires were found in the harbor, no bits of wires, which certainly would have floated up along the shore. Reason number 3, if an explosion happened in the water, there would have been a massive amount of dead fish, not just in the radius of the explosion, but because of the shock wave that comes out. There were I shouldn't say no, but there was not a massive amount of dead fish that washed up on the shore or floating around, which would imply the bomb wasn't in the water, it was actually in the boat itself. So years later, long after the Spanish-American War occurred, they basically got the wreckage of the USS Maine and were able to dive into it. And when they did, they found out that the explosion came from the coal bunker. The explosion came from interior and exploded outward. The coal bunker kind of exploded. Now, the theory is that the coal bunker kind of exploded and it was right next to where the ammunition was held, which of course is a move I would have done, very efficient use of space management. And that caused the ammunition, and the USS Maine had a lot of ammunition, and should I say weapons, to blow up. And that's going to lead to the whole boat blowing up. All of this evidence really wasn't too explicitly, it wasn't persuasively explained at the time, because all the newspapers in America were publishing, it was the Spain that did it. Spain's fault. We have evidence. And they start publishing all these articles that exaggerated the truth were propaganda. And Americans would read these articles and suddenly they're like, oh, Spain definitely did it. We have to go to war with Spain. Now, when newspapers use half-truths, bias, propaganda, exaggerations to get people to buy their papers, this is a type of journalism called yellow journalism. Now, what newspapers are supposed to do is search for the truth, protect the people, and expose people that are trying to harm the people. However, during a time of yellow journalism, that's when a newspaper has these huge pictures where they're utilizing flashy colors and flashy headlines to get Americans to buy the papers. And if you're walking by a newspaper and it has this flashy headline, the Spanish are trying to kill us, you'll probably buy it. And these newspapers were competing to try to make money to survive. And they were no longer caring as much about the truth as flashy headlines, exaggerating stories. So that type of yellow journalism is going to make the American people want war, to blame Spain. Now, this would be an example of yellow journalism. If you walked by and saw this, it's going to make you angry. And you're going to want to read that article and buy that paper. And you're going to think Spain did it. So really, why did the Spanish-American War happen? You can make a case that yellow journalism might be reason number one. We have to be super careful about this. The term yellow journalism comes from this cartoon that was published by the newspapers prior to the Spanish-American War, where basically they used what they called the Yellow Kid, the title of the article. Newspapers were always black and white, and suddenly some newspapers started publishing this cartoon with yellow. People are like, that's amazing. There's color. There's absolutely color in the newspaper. And it looked so amazing. It was like having a black and white TV, suddenly having a color TV. So people bought that newspaper, just the use of yellow ink. And that's where yellow journalism comes from. So it's Spain's fault. Americans started chanting, remember the Maine, to hell with Spain. You know, and again, Spain must have been so frustrated because they didn't do it. And we wanted to attack. So the United States demanded that Spain leave Cuba immediately, or else. Spain said, mind your own business. This is ours. You have nothing to do with this. So it looks like war is coming, but the American public were still divided. Some wanted war, some didn't. So we had a national debate. It was between imperialists and anti-imperialists. People that wanted to conquer, people that didn't want to conquer. Now, the imperialist arguments were we should go to war. Number one, to get revenge for the Maine. Two, if we do kick Spain out of there, we can take over Cuba, we can put a military base there, and now that military base will bring us really close, militarily speaking, to Central and Latin America. That will allow us to control all of this land, and land is power. Three, if we put a military base there, that gives us a foothold for influence. So I'm not even talking conquering lands, but that would allow us to build a canal. At this point, if we wanted to travel anywhere in Asia or to the west coast of our country, we had to go all the way around South America. Totally inefficient, to the point where we barely even tried to make the trip. But if we could get permission to build a canal, now we could cut through, and that's going to double our strength, particularly economically trying to get to Asia. However, Spain, France, any of the powers of Central America weren't letting us build a canal. So, but if we had some military force in the area by defeating Spain, taking over Cuba, that would give us some influence to maybe do it. And militarily speaking, we wanted our military to be able to go from our east coast to west coast to get over to Asia. That would be important. Economically, we wanted our ships to be able to trade with Asia by cutting through and not having to go all the way around South America. That leads to money and wealth and power. Number four, why this war was appealing for imperialists. Cuba had so much trade with us. They were so close. We traded a lot, and trade creates wealth, but we suddenly were not trading the last 30 years because they were in the middle of political discord. They were in the middle of a revolution. Wars stopped trade. So basically, we weren't trading with Cuba. We were losing out big time. If we could take over Cuba, they're now part of our territory, our country. We can now trade with them. That is stimulating our economy. That's awesome. So either way, we're losing money. We got to fight Spain to take over Cuba. Number five, we also felt massive sympathy. The Spanish were killing civilians of Cuba. Once again, all because of Weyler's tactics about concentration camps. We need to save them. Number six, we did have a little bit of religious prejudice. Most of the America was founded on Protestant principles, I should say, not Catholic. Most of America, even today, is strongly Christian and Protestant, and Spain was Catholic. And there's going to be massive prejudice in the United States for some time, even today, against Catholicism. And Spain was a Catholic country. Let's kick them out of our hemisphere and kick them out of this country of Cuba. So there was some desire there. Another reason why the Spanish-American War was appealing was just principles of freedom in general. We had fought under George Washington against the British and won our freedom. Many Americans wanted to support the Cuban people and make everybody free, which is ironic because so many other people wanted to then just conquer Cuba. So kind of contradictory. And nationalistic pride. If we beat up Spain and then take over Cuba, we can also take over the Spanish Empire. And British had massive empire, biggest empire in the history of the world. And we were jealous of it. France and Spain also, France had empire, Portugal had empire, an empire, the Dutch had an empire. We were jealous, and we could start our empire by beating up Spain and taking what they had. So there were all types of imperialist arguments. Let's get revenge. Let's put a military base in Cuba after we kick the Spanish out. Taking over Cuba will give us influence over making a canal, which we need for economic and military reasons. This will keep trade stable in Cuba, and we want that trade with Cuba. The sympathy for what the Spanish were doing to the Cuban people. We wanted the Catholics out, and the Spanish were Catholics. And we just wanted to support freedom in general, and the Spanish were denying freedom to Cuba. But also the hope of beating somebody else up, a world power, would make us feel strong. America did great. We are powerful, and we could even have our own empire, which also satisfies the needs of nationalism. But the anti-imperialists said no. Those are all great reasons, but it's not happening. Anti-imperialist arguments, people that were against imperialism. We should not go to war because imperialism is wrong, beating up Spain and taking their stuff. No, we should mind our own business, stay in our own country. It's just wrong taking from others. This war isn't about freedom or helping the Cubans, which the imperialists kept talking about. Fake arguments. Because this was just a hidden excuse to take over Cuba. That's what the anti-imperialists said. You keep talking about fighting against Cuba to save the Cuba, fighting against Spain to save the Cubans for freedom. But no, this is just an excuse to conquer Cuba. It's a hidden. You're lying, you imperialists. So, to go to war, you needed most of America to agree to go to war. But the anti-imperialists wouldn't vote for the war. So, to get the anti-imperialists on the imperialist side to vote for the war, the imperialists finally compromised. They passed what was known as the Teller Amendment. The Teller Amendment was an amendment to the Declaration of War against Spain. And it basically said, you know what? We are fighting this war to save the Cuban people. We won't conquer them. In fact, if we win a war against Spain, that's great, but we are not allowed to take over Cuba. If we go to war against Spain and win, we absolutely, according to the Teller Amendment, have to let Cuba go free. So now that the Teller Amendment was part of the Declaration of War against Spain, the anti-imperialists passed it. They voted for it. Why were they now on board? Because this was an opportunity to help the Cuban people. So it was a good war. So we, in fact, declare war. 1898, the war begins. Spanish-American War. Now, it's going to take place really in two places, the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean. Now, specifically over in the Philippines, because the Philippines and the Pacific is where the Spanish they owned the Philippines, so their navy was there, much of their navy, and in Cuba and Puerto Rico over in the Caribbean. That's where this war takes place. Now, to be even more specific, again, Cuba and the Philippines. So let's look at the war in the Pacific first. The Philippines, right there. Perfect. Excellent. If we look a little closer, Philippines, not all that far from Taiwan and China. Now, Spain had conquered the Philippines in 1521. They had the Spanish Navy there protecting the Philippines. Now, to win a war, you have to defeat the army of the enemy. But you also have to defeat the Navy, which is what was by the Philippines. So we need to destroy Spain's Spanish fleet. Well, there we were. We go to the Philippines. We go to, Commodore George Dewey, the head of our Navy, our squadron, is right outside of Manila Bay, Manila being the capital of the Philippines. And he comes on in and attacks the Spanish fleet. Now, the Battle of Manila Bay, over 400 Spanish sailors lost their lives. How many U.S. lives were lost? 0. Absolutely none. Now, we're good. We're just not that good. Part of the thing was the Spanish ammunition was low. And you couldn't really just put an order on Amazon at that time. No drone was going to fly up with more ammunition. So they were kind of hurting. Now, the famous line Commodore Dewey said, "You may fire when ready, Gridley." Basically, what this reflects is an overabundance of arrogance and confidence. Just fire whenever you need to. We're going to take them out no matter what, which was true. Now, the American ships were ironclads. We had this new Navy, And basically, when your ships are made of iron, that's a pretty big thing around 1900. Whereas the Spanish ships were the older ships of their empire made of wood. Now, when you fire cannonballs or any metal substance against wood and you hit it hard enough, it will splinter. That's exactly what happened to the Spanish fleet. And we dominated, just dominated. Our guns were bigger and longer, and that meant they could fire further. So we just positioned our ships outside of where the Spanish ships could fire. We came up, and the Spanish could only fire here. We could fire a lot further. So we stayed outside their range and just took them out. That's why nobody died on our end. Now the Philippines were captured. Next up, we sailed to an island in the middle of the Pacific called Guam. Guam is just right here. The Spanish had that, and we came up to Guam. And on June 20th, the USS Charleston arrived at Guam. Now, when we arrived, immediately, a little fear of a big battle, right? Now, Guam didn't even know we were at war. Apparently Spain should have texted them on their cell phones, but those didn't exist. They didn't even know. So Guam taken without firing anything. In fact, the Spanish even came out of their fort and said, "Hey, how you doing?" And we kind of said, "Yeah, you're under arrest. We're at war. You're done." So Guam was taken out. So we go on to Cuba. Now, more Spanish troops were located, or most of them were on the southern side of the island near Santiago. Now, Santiago is a hilly region, and basically, in war, it's always important to capture the higher ground, because on the higher ground, you can put your artillery and fire down on your enemy. And that gives you a strategic advantage. So you can always block people firing at you from the side. You can even, under some duress, defend yourself from being attacked on both sides. But it's impossible if somebody has the high ground and they can fire from above you. You're just going to lose. And that's entirely what happened. Leads to one of my famous or favorite scenes in the third movie of Star Wars, where basically Anakin, the superior athlete, going up against Obi-Wan Kenobi, and Obi-Wan says, "Don't attack me, I have the high ground." And this turned out not to work out well for the future Darth Vader. High ground, super important. So anyway, we captured the hills. Now, this is why it was important in the Battle of San Juan Hill that we captured the hills ahead of time. And Teddy Roosevelt played a role in capturing these hills. He basically worked kind of for the Navy, and he had a desk job. He said, "No, I want to fight in this war. I love war." So he quit his desk job, formed the Rough Riders, a collection of athletes and former Division I athletes and cowboys, and made this basically all-star group of fighters, which is kind of cool. And then they went to the Battle of San Juan Hill, and they stormed up the surrounding hills to win the high ground, which is going to lead to Santiago surrendering even before almost it was attacked. And somebody is going to make a movie, basically a newsreel, out of Teddy Roosevelt, the leader of the Rough Riders. And that's going to make him super famous. He went from just being a pencil pusher to a national hero. Nobody won more from the Spanish-American War than Roosevelt. So now Guam's gone, Philippines gone, Cuba essentially conquered. There's only Puerto Rico left. So what happens with Puerto Rico? Well, there it is, right next to Cuba. And once again, where's Puerto Rico? Right there, sweet. On July 25th, 3,300 American soldiers invaded Puerto Rico. And we were still in the middle of fighting. The battle was not over. Nobody had dominated. In fact, it was kind of a tie. But Spain surrendered. They're like, "We don't have a navy left. We've been defeated. We got to give in." So after they lost Guam, Philippines, and Cuba, they say, "You know what? I'm out. Please, U.S., peace. We want peace." So the U.S. agreed to stop fighting if and only if you end up giving us, if you give us Guam for our trouble, and if you give us Puerto Rico. That's what we want. Give us those two places. Now, this was known as the Treaty of Paris because, of course, that's where the negotiations were. France, in the nice way that they were, offered to host us for our negotiations. So we got 2 out of their 4 colonies. Now, the Spanish Navy was gone, and you can't really manage the Philippines far away from Spain without a navy. So afterwards, they're like, "We want to unload this. We can't manage it anyway." So they offered to sell it to us for $20 million. $20 million. Now, what happened to Cuba? Well, Cuba, remember, the United States desperately wanted Cuba, and absolutely President McKinley wanted Cuba. We had that pesky little Teller Amendment that the anti-imperialists made us put in the Declaration of War. We were not allowed to keep Cuba after the war, so ultimately the U.S. still had to let Cuba go. Now, it's going to be complicated we are going to basically kind of control them a little bit, but we're going to get into that later. But they were allowed to go free. So which of these 4 colonies does the U.S. still own today? Well, and the answer would be we still own Guam. That is a territory of the United States today. And Puerto Rico is a territory of the United States today. And everybody born in Puerto Rico is a U.S. citizen. So we have those two. Now the Philippines, we're going to purchase and own, and we're going to let them go, I think, in 1947. But they've had their freedom for a long time now. Now this war got a nickname. That nickname was, it was a splendid little war. Now that phrase came from a letter that the American ambassador to Britain, John Hay, called this conflict in a letter to Teddy Roosevelt. Wow, what a great, wonderful, splendid little war. Why was it splendid? Well, number one, because it only lasted 4 months. If you're going to have a war, you want it to be over quickly. Number two, only 385 Americans were killed. Now, and so that's a good war, but 1,700 others died, but they died by disease. Problem was Cuba was a lot of jungle, rainforest, and that's a lot of mosquitoes, and that's a lot of spread of disease. So a lot of death. 3, Guam, Philippines, Puerto Rico, we got an empire out of it. So we were a power, but we weren't a great power until we got our empire. So this was basically an announcement that the U.S. was now a great power. The rest of the world, look out. So how did the Spanish-American War change the world? Number one, Spain had been the most powerful country in the world in the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s. And now this is really the end of their demise. They're gone. They're not going to play a major role on the world stage ever, well, at least even up to today. So this is kind of their swan song a little bit. Number two, the U.S. now is a great power. And we absolutely are going to become a superpower economically and militarily. And this was our launching point right here. So we are going to be seen as a powerhouse. Number three, imperialism becomes popular. So many people that would have been against imperialism now have an empire, and we just won. It's kind of like watching your team win a football game or basketball team. It riles you up. All right, when's the next game? So many Americans are going to become very militaristic after this and pro-imperialism. So number four, public opinion does change about imperialism. We talked about that. And now that we have the Philippines there, and now that we want to spread our wings, so to speak, we want to get to China and trade, we need a refueling station to get to the Philippines and China. So this is going to change people's mind, and McKinley's going to be like, fine, I want to annex Hawaii. There was a huge debate about annexing Hawaii, and now we do. So Hawaii is taken. That's going to be an important, significant move that affects a lot of people. Now we have a major decision to make. Basically, the Philippines, do we keep or let them go? And the anti-imperialists say, no, we just won this war fighting for freedom. And now we're just going to conquer the Philippines? This is immoral. Other people were prejudiced. They're like, if we invite the Philippines to be part of our country, many of the Filipino people are going to come to the United States, and that's going to be a lot of cheap labor, and that's going to compete with the people already here, and they're going to lose jobs. It's going to bring salaries down. So no, we can't do this. So did the U.S. end up conquering the Philippines? Well, President McKinley, take a second to read this, please. This is what he wrote. I didn't know whether to conquer the Philippines. I walked the floor of the White House night after night until midnight. And I am not ashamed to tell you, gentlemen, that I went down on my knees and prayed Almighty God for light and guidance more than one night. And one night it came to me in this way, that we could not give the Philippines back to Spain. That would be cowardly. That we could not turn them over to France and Germany, who would conquer them, of course. Our commercial rivals in the Orient. That would be bad business. And there was nothing left to do but to take them and educate the Filipinos and uplift and civilize them. And by God's grace, do the very, very best thing for our fellow men who Christ had died for them. We need to teach them about Christ. And then I went to bed and went to sleep and slept soundly. So basically, he's touting here white man's burden. It is our job to save these uncivilized people and teach them how to be good people, civilized people, godly people. They're barbaric, but we can help them. That's the job of white people, Western civilization. Definitely its roots in paternalism and racism. They were unfit for self-rule. They didn't even know how to rule themselves. They had Spain rule them, and now they need us to rule them. All these excuses. Once again, paternalism. The idea that we need to support and help them. Now, this political cartoon, its message is a little bit different. It's basically saying all these people are backward, and we need to turn them into good citizens, teach them how to live. So if we don't, Japan and Germany are going to conquer them anyway, and so it's our responsibility, our destiny, to have this massive empire where we're helping all of these people, and of course getting this land before our enemies get it. This would allow us to trade with China. And China has more customers than anybody else. And that's an economic benefit that we need. We can't let pass up, and so on. So it turns out the Filipino people thought differently. They thought that we were on their side, that we helped get rid of the oppressors of Spain. But now all of a sudden we came and said, oh yeah, by the way, we weren't giving you your freedom. We were just getting rid of Spain so we could take your freedom ourselves. They fought against us for 3 years. And ironically, we actually used a lot of the same tactics the Spanish used against the Cubans to basically subdue them, suppress them. And after the 3-year war, they finally gave up and we won. Philippines were our colony from 1898 to 1946. And ultimately, after World War II, since we were again going against Hitler, saying we're fighting for freedom, we felt somewhat some hypocrisy and gave them their freedom after that war. So in 1946, they did get their freedom. Now, remind me, why is imperialism wrong? Why is imperialism okay? Well, your next assignment will be related to that. So thank you for watching this, and please look in Google Classroom for your next assignment as related to the Spanish-American War.